And I want Tucker Carlson to go to China too.
Well, he needs to.
Yes.
He absolutely. I mean, this would be a very big education for him
Yeah. Yeah.
because I mean, he's full of nonsense about China. It's so
China. Yeah.
strange that
Yeah.
such a clever man
Hmm.
who is so clever about Russia and Hungary and other
Yeah.
places, so uncritically accepts all the rubbish, so much of the rubbish that is said about China.
China.
I was
Uh-huh.
pleased to see that Putin had no truck with him on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, since we're talking about that, so I made a program about the Tucker Carlson's interview, which I would talk to you. There are quite a few spots that I want to talk to you about. But let's
Of
start
course.
at just saying that I made a program in Chinese and in English. So in both cases, my quite a few of my viewers are saying that they think Tucker Carlson, he still is the defender of the empire. He just doesn't want the U.S. to be tied up in Ukraine. He wants the U.S. to line up with with at least have a good relationship with Russia, so that U.S. can target to China. Now, I'm not sure I totally agree, but I'm not. I mean, like you said, it's strange that an educated, smart person like Tucker Carlson knows so little about China. That itself tells me something, that maybe he's just not that interested in knowing China. He just set his mind that China is the enemy. What do you think? Do you think he is really still the defender of the empire, or he is more or less interested in peace?
It's a very good point, actually, and I think the people the way you put the question
Hmm.
actually puts the finger onto the muddle that you actually find in the United States about from critics of US foreign policy about US foreign policy. Because I think that at a certain level, and I'm going to say this, I think Tucker Carlson is an anti imperialist American. He wants the United States to basically mind its own business. He's very conscious of the accumulating problems within the United States. He talks about them all the time. He is very critical of American adventures around the world. And in this, by the way, I should stress, he doesn't just speak for himself. This is a growing current of opinion amongst many Americans, including conservative Americans and especially working class Americans. They say enough of these wars, enough of us going around the world, enough of us trying to organize and reorganize everything and shape the world according to our own private personal interests. But at the same time, people like Tucker Carlson and these sort of people, they still want America to be number one. They have so on the one hand, they don't want it intervening and involving itself in world affairs, but they still want it to be the most powerful country. And of course, they are now becoming increasingly nervous about the fact that another country, China, is potentially even more powerful than the United States itself is. And this is worrying them. Yesterday on the Duran, I did a program with former Ambassador Chas Freeman, who is, by the way, one of the officials who accompanied Richard Nixon to Beijing in 1972. So somebody who served in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, in the past, and he is a huge critic of U.S. foreign policy and of the way in which the United States is intervening in all sorts of places. And in some ways, a much more erudite critic than Tucker Carlson is. He still, however, has this concern and worry about China. And it is very strange. Now, I think there are some explanations for this, and I would single four. Firstly, China is very big. It is bigger than the United States. Its economy, on the basis of purchasing power parity, which is the only measure that really matters, is bigger than that of the United States. That is something Americans are completely not used to, and it is freaking them out. Second, it is Asian, and this racism, which most Americans who are critics simply won't admit to, even to themselves, well, that is there. It's clearly makes them feel particularly worried that it won't just be another white European country that will overtake them. It will be, those Asian people who, at some fundamental level, we really do believe are inferior and who should watch their place. So there is racism as well. The third is communism. China is still it's led by the Communist Party of China. Um, it's something that Americans still, in my experience, have an absolute ideological obsession with communism. Even Americans whom I find highly intelligent people and in many respects very likable and friendly, clever people, and very, well aware of the world. The moment you get onto the subject of communism, I mean, every kind of logical or reasonable or rational discussion goes completely out of the window. And lastly, and this ties up to some extent with the racist issue, but with people like Tucker Carlson and some people, a lot of people actually, on the American right, there's a fourth factor, which is that China is not Christian. And you see this with Tucker Carlson in particular. I mean, he likes Hungary, for example. He was talking a lot to Putin about Christianity. And it's not as dominant a factor in US thinking as it used to be, the thinking of the American people, because far fewer Americans today self-identify as Christians than was the case, say, 20, 30 years ago. But it is still there, especially on the right. So China is a big, non-Christian, communist, Asian country. So, of course, we don't like it.
They're very different, just in all aspects, are very different from the United States.
Yes, it is. I'm going to say something about this, and I'm going to challenge a view. I mean, political life in China is different, but Chinese people, whom I've met many of them, very straightforward. Chinese culture, extremely accessible. Chinese philosophy, which I have read in translation, again, very accessible. I don't find China, culturally speaking, as difficult as some people seem to do.
Yeah.
And for example, when I went to China, I went to Shanghai and Nanjing and Suzhou and those sort of places. I didn't get the sense of culture shock that I have found in some other places. This is a country I could relate to quite well. And by the way, I know many other Westerners who've actually gone to China and lived there and worked there and done business, and they think like me.
Yeah, actually, I've been to not all the Asia, but parts of Asia. I actually find that China probably among the ones that are more westernized in a lot of ways, more accepting the Western in a lot of ways, I think. Especially if you talk to people, big cities, there's no different. Everybody's thinking more or less the same way. Yeah. And then the Chinese culture, I would say in general, is a culture that actually doesn't bother other people. You see, that's something people don't understand. Like they feel like the Communist Party are very intrusive, very controlling, watching all the time. No, in reality, my experience just recently, when I went back to China last year, November, I met a friend of mine who I haven't met for a long time, but we're very close, back college years. For all these years, I never knew she's a Catholic. I never knew that. Because it's never occurred to me to ask her, are you, what religion are you? And it never occurred to her that she needs to tell me that part of her life. It is her life. I mean, I didn't know that she actually went to church back then when we were together in college. I never knew that. It's not like she's hiding from me or she's hiding from anybody. It's just that nobody thought that's important. You know what I mean? So we talk about our families, our parents, or siblings, all these kind of things. We are very close. But it just never occurred to us, okay, what is the religion you're in, with church? It's very Chinese, actually. Just we don't bother each other like that. It's not important.
That was absolutely my impression when I went to China as well. I found that it's one of the most relaxed countries
Mhm.
I've ever been to. I mean, I know places in Europe which are much more edgy, and
Mhm.
where people are much more nervous about what's going on around them than
Yeah.
they feel in China. Britain, by the way, being a case in point. The
Mhm.
Chinese just get on with their lives, and
Yeah. Yeah.
they're the government. I mean, it's got lots to do.
Yeah.
There are so
Exactly.
many. There are so many people in China.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not going to spend its time trying
Yeah.
to monitor and watch and
Every.
look at what everybody says. In
Mhm.
fact, the thing you notice in China when you're there, at least the thing I notice in China, is how relaxed politically it was.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I can tell you there are other places that I visited when that has absolutely not been the case. And of course, if you're talking about my childhood, where in Greece in the 1960s, when there was a period of military dictatorship, and before that time, semi dictatorship as well, which I remember very clearly. Well, that was a country where you felt the government and the weight of the government on you to an extreme degree, and you have nothing like that in today's China.
Yeah. And to to compare, I just find it, the other day I was even asking my husband, I said, how come we know all our neighbor, what kind of, because we know we have a neighbor who is a Mormon, and we also know who in our neighbor is Catholic. We know all that. And I was like, how come we know all that? Why do we need to know that? Whereas, my close friend, for all this year, I never knew she's Catholic, I just find that's interesting.
Well, there you go. And I mean, again, you could talk about social media as well. I mean, you say the wrong thing. We've just
Yeah.
had a political scandal today the last couple of days in Britain, where the candidate for the Labour Party in a local election, somebody overheard him say something in a meeting, a private meeting, which was some people construed as
Mhm.
conspiracist about Israel. And the poor man has just been absolutely obliterated. I mean, it's and again, whatever
Yeah.
that is not a relaxed country where people behave like that.
Yeah. 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 Okay. About the interview in general,
Mm.
what is your general impression? My impression is Putin actually is the dominant party in this one. I like the fact that Tucker Carlson let him talk.
Mm.
That's part of he's not attacking him, he's not lecturing him. He was raising issues and then Putin talk. I like that part. But then also I just feel like Putin is the one in control of this interview. He's the dominant force. Is that your impression?
Oh, absolutely. He was completely in control. I mean, he
Yeah.
ran the interview entirely, and you're absolutely right. Tucker let him do it, and he was right to let him do it, because of course the problem is in the West. Whenever people try to interview Putin, whenever mainstream journalists try to interview Putin, all that it becomes eventually is a shouting match. They interrupt him, they're rude to him, they don't let him finish, they don't let him speak. Putin this time was given the opportunity to speak and to speak at length. And beyond that, he clearly is a person in control. I mean, he is fully in control of the facts. He's incredibly well informed. Of course, you and I, we've been following Putin for a long time. We knew that, but most people in the West have not been exposed to it. He's fully in control of the facts. He has a sense of humor. He has a tendency to lecture. He has a certain interest in history. Again, some people in the United States and Britain are alarmed by this. In Russia, they're not, because they're very historically minded. I think the same, by the way, from Chinese people I know. Chinese people, in my experience, know their history. Russians do. They don't find long discussions about history surprising. Putin was able to do that. He answered every question as far as I could see. He was very open, and he was clearly in top mental form. We've been hearing all these stories about how he's ill, he's got cancer, he's senile, he's being represented by doubles. Well, all of that is clearly nonsense.
Yeah. And after the interview, I saw also Tucker, he himself commented on that. He said he felt like Putin was wounded because he tried so many times trying to work with the West and always being turned down. I actually don't feel he's wounded. I feel he's frustrated. I feel that Putin trying, he's like, we have no ill intention towards you. We want to work with you, and you just keep on turn, against us. And in a very profound way. I feel like it's more or less the Chinese also feel that way, that kind of frustration. Like we want to do business with you. That's it. We don't have any other intention to hurt you. Why are you just turn your back and just demonize us, all this. I think in that sense, I can very much relate to that. Is that how your impression is?
I think you're absolutely right. I think you got it exactly correct. I think that Tucker, like a lot of Westerners, imagines that the Russians yearn to be admitted and brought into the West and to be given a seat at the top table. What they want is to be left alone. I mean, they've said this many times. Just accept us as we are, and let's just find ways to make the world safer and better to live with together. We don't want to change you, but please don't come constantly and try to change us. We are not going to be changed in your interests or to reflect your desires, but you never stop. You won't stop leaving us. You won't stop. You won't leave us alone. That was what Putin was saying. And you're quite correct. He went out of his way to say we made effort after effort to try to find some means with you. We said, can we join NATO? And then you told us no. And then we said, all right, we won't pursue that because you clearly don't want us in NATO. Can we find some understanding about security issues in Europe? And they said no. And then he said, well, all right, let's try and find a political way forward. Let's try and build economic links. Let's do this. And always the initiative to break these contacts comes from the West. And what he's basically said, look, we've tried again. You clearly don't want to have anything to do with us. So be it. We'll just go ahead, sort things out for ourselves. And, we got many other partners in the world who are prepared, much more practical and level-headed, and will do business with us, even if you won't. I mean, there was resignation and frustration. Certainly not any sense of being wounded, that he's been rejected or anything of that kind.
Yeah. And yesterday I had a conversation with somebody. I asked a question about. I'm like you. I'm not a military person, so from time to time I need to ask questions from somebody. But anyway, so we talked about it. He's also Chinese. We both agree that like China never really want to be the number one. Number one is a hard thing to do because everybody will ask you for favors, ask you to protection, ask you this and that. It's a lot of work, okay, to be the number one. And US want to do it fine, but just let us do our own business, right? Let enrich our own people, let them, living better. That's all China wants. And I guess that's all Russia wants, right? But somehow the US is always like afraid somebody would take over. Somebody is somehow dangerous to the US interest. Isn't that like just that's fundamentally the problem, right?
You are completely right, and this, of course, flows from the psychology of the European states, of which, of course, the United States, in a kind of way, is itself a creation. It's a European creation. Europe has been engaged in extreme interstate competition ever since the fall of the Roman Empire. And it's always been about ultimately becoming the hegemon. There's even a very famous book, history book, about Europe, which is written by a British historian called A.J.P. Taylor, who, by the way, I briefly knew. And the title of that book is The Struggle for Mastery in Europe. And this has created the entire Western understanding of international relations, that there is constant competition between states for power, with the ultimate objective of one state becoming dominant over all of the others. And you have to compete and struggle all the time to preserve that leading position. And if you lose it, then you go into something called decline, and your country becomes weak and vulnerable. And people bring up examples like 17th century Spain, 20th century France, and perhaps today's Britain, and things of that kind. Well, that is a European view, but it is not a Chinese view, nor is it, by the way, a Russian view, because these are huge continental civilizational states. China has never aspired to world domination or global control. You will never find a single period in Chinese history where that has been true. I mean, the Romans were up to it, the Spanish were up to it, the British were up to it. The Chinese have never been up to it, despite the fact that for most of Chinese history, again, a fact most people don't know, China has been by far the world's richest and most powerful country. But there's never been a time when China has produced a Napoleon or a Hitler or someone like that. This is not the Chinese thing at all. But of course, Westerners, imbued with a completely different sense of international relations, simply won't accept that. And this is where the frustration of many Chinese scholars, I mean, serious scholars about China in the West, who understand this very well. This is where they feel that they're not being listened to. I'll give you one example. I mean, one of the things you got constantly people bring up all the time, I mean, people who don't really know much about Chinese history, is that they've heard about something called the tribute system, which supposedly regulated Chinese relations with certain Asian states during the period of the Ming dynasty. And this is supposed to be proof that the Chinese have some kind of desire to dominate people. The point about the tribute system, which is, by the way, a Western invention, is the West that have invented this concept to describe this, is that it was a system. It was a system of international relations which sought reciprocity. It was not a dominant system. China's never come along and said to Japan, for example, you must run your country in this particular way. That's never been what the Chinese have been about.
No, yeah. And that's the thing that lots of people misunderstand China. And even Tucker Carlson's question, one of his questions he asked Putin was, okay, now the question is, you're replacing one colonial power with another, a less forgiving and less sentimental one. That was his question, right? He's referring to China. I mean,
I wasn't aware that any European colonial power, France, Britain, Spain, or let's be frank, the United States, which has also in its time been a colonial power, I have never found any Western colonial power be at all sympathetic or any of the things that Tucker is talking about. I have no idea what he's talking about. China has never been a colonial power, never, not at any point in its history. It has fought to escape colonialism and fought successfully, by the way, to resist colonialism. It has always opposed it in others, and it has no interest in seeking that with anyone else. If China wanted that, it has had at many times in its history the opportunity to achieve it. And there has never been, anybody who knows Chinese history at all well, anybody who reads, the kind of things that were being discussed, in the imperial court, for example. Well, I'm going to come back to that word because that's an important point anyway. But if anybody who knows sort of debates that have happened in China will know that that has never been what the Chinese have been seeking. And let me just now come back to that word empire and imperial, because of course Westerners in order to explain Chinese things, use Western words. So the person who, ruled China, the succession of the Huangdi,
yeah.
Westerners refer to him as the emperor. But of course, an emperor in a Western concept is a military leader, first and foremost. That is where the word comes from. It means he who exercises military power. It's a Latin word. And of course, the Roman Empire was a militaristic power. Huangdi has a completely different meaning. It doesn't mean that at all. So calling the person the Chinese refer to as Huangdi, emperor, completely misunderstands what he is and what role he has within the traditional Chinese system.
That's yes. And also emperor just give people the feeling that you constantly want to expand your empire, right? You need an empire to be an emperor, right? So what is an empire if it's not keep on spending, right? So okay.
Well, this is exactly the point, because that is exactly what the Roman Empire did. I mean, it was all about expansion. And of course, it's what all other empires do. So if you call the emperor, the Huangdi, the emperor, then it must follow that, China must be bent on expansion. There is, as I said, no evidence of this at any point in Chinese history. And I've discussed this before. You read Chinese literature, if you read Chinese poetry, which of course I cannot read in their original language, which is a great problem. And if you look at Chinese paintings, this is a culture of peace. It is not a culture of war, and it is certainly not a culture of aggression.
Yeah, I totally agree, because one thing very different in terms of evaluating a leader, historical leader. In China, if you say an emperor is a good one, you normally say, okay, during his time, it's peaceful, right? It is. But in the US, for example, they like the president in the wartime. That's what, make this president great, right? A war president, it seems like, is the thing.
Exactly. I mean, success in the West of a ruler is measured most by the ruler's success in war.
Yeah. Very much in the US, definitively. Yeah.
Definitely.
And maybe that's part of the reason they can never stop having wars, because that's how they measure themselves. I don't know. Now, one thing I think is probably not surprising to us, but still remarkable, that if you listen to Putin, he said this multiple times, right? He trying to join NATO and was rejected. I mean, Bill Clinton said it was okay, and then later said no after he talked to his people. And then he asked, I think George W. Bush, he said, your president, I think it's George W. Bush, about the CIA support of the Caucasus, right? And George W. Bush was surprised, oh, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, but then come back, and CIA basically said, yeah, we are doing that. And, it's like nothing you can do. And then he also tried to work with the US to build a missile defense system together with the Europeans. And again, in the beginning, the president seems okay with it. And then later, Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates came to Kremlin, just told him in person, no, we're not going to, work that with you. Oh, it's not against you, it's against the Iran. I mean, that kind of thing. And then I would throw two more things. One is we all know that Barack Obama wasn't that interested in really bombing Libya. It was Hillary Clinton pushing him, right? It was a big pressure from her to do that. And then the other thing is, of course, when Donald Trump was the president, he really was being told last minute about this kidnap of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei founder. And he even said something. He asked John Bolton, why are you doing that? And Meng Wanzhou is the Chinese Ivanka Trump, which means Trump himself wasn't that, he's not even aware of that. So all these things you look together, they are like, no matter who the president is, they are constantly being overwritten by the people that are under them, different bureaucrats. And these people somehow just always manage to override the president and gets their way. Is that how it should be? It's very frustrating.
It is the single, I think that was one of the most important revelations about the interview. Even if you think you've come to an agreement with the President of the United States, even if you think you've achieved an understanding with him. It means nothing, because the President of the United States doesn't talk for the United States. The bureaucracy, the political class, the elite, as Putin calls it, can simply overrule him. And they repeatedly do. And I think that is something that every important world leader who has dealt with the United States has found out. And it's made them, it's not just the Russians. I think the Chinese have discovered it. In fact, I remember, I've mentioned this many times in our program, Xi Jinping telling Joe Biden to his face, you tell me one thing, you go away, and the opposite happens. They were talking about Taiwan, by the way. So that makes it impossible in the end to conduct the diplomacy and negotiations with the United States. Because if you can't agree anything with the president, if the president is continuously overruled and lacks the power to make his decisions effective, then what is the point in talking to him? And given that he supposedly leads the United States, who else are you supposed to talk to? So the result is there's no point conducting diplomacy with the United States, because nothing can ever happen. The person you talk to has no power, and the people who do have power, you can't talk to.
Yeah. Remember, there was one time at the UN, they were talking about Gaza, and the ambassador from the US, the UN, she even raised her hand, and then somebody behind her literally put her hand down. I mean, just that was in front of everybody to see. It's like, no, you cannot. I mean, what are they doing?
Yeah, exactly.
It's,
This is absolutely. You're completely right. I mean, they're just showcasing the fact that power is not held by those we think it is.
yeah. And then there's two questions I find very interesting. One is Putin said he told Biden, this was before the war, and that he was saying that you are making a mistake. Now, he didn't say what Biden's response was. I was very curious. Now, although I think I probably know what Biden would have said. He would say, oh, I don't want to see you in a war, but you don't need to worry that if, Ukraine has the right to join NATO, you don't need to worry, NATO is not against you. Something like that. But I'm still curious what Biden has to say. I think probably Tucker should interview Biden to ask him about that. But the second question is really very interesting. I find even more interesting is when he talked to Vladimir, Zelensky, and he said, "What are you doing? Your father was fighting the Nazis in the front line." Now that one, I really was very curious what Vladimir, Zelensky would say. Wouldn't you say?
Well, absolutely. Now, in fact, Putin apparently got out wrong. It wasn't the father; it was the grandfather.
Oh, okay.
Zelensky's grandfather who fought the Nazis.
Okay.
But apparently, his father was also a very strong Soviet patriot and, committed supporter of the system. Somebody who was deeply, deeply hostile to all the things that Zelensky stands for. And again, it is very frustrating that we don't know what Zelensky's response was. And I would be fascinated to hear. And I think that what Zelensky said would probably disappoint us. I doubt that he would have given a straightforward and coherent answer, because he's not going to admit that the people that are there, that Putin is talking about, the Nazis, he's not going to admit to their existence or to their influence. And at the same time, and by not admitting to that, he's not really going to explain why he's taking the steps that he's taking. Putin was very careful to tell us things that he had said to various leaders, but he's very, very careful to keep confidences and not to tell us what they said in response. And that's an interesting contrast, by the way, because Western leaders often tell others quite open and in interviews what Putin or Xi Jinping or anybody has said to them, and usually they misrepresent it also.
Yeah, yeah, I also find that too. Yeah, they say something I find very hard to believe that, Putin or Xi Jinping have said those things many times.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one thing I really, this is something really I have a long time kind of wondered. Putin brought that again about the NATO expansion, and he pointed out that you guys promised us you're not going to expand eastwards other than the East Germany. And then somebody supposedly said, "Oh, well, it's not enshrined on paper, so we will expand." Well, my question is, why didn't Russia put it on paper? Why didn't sign some kind of a memorandum with NATO or something?
That's a very good question, and it's one, by the way, that the Russians ask themselves all the time. And many, many Russians are very, very angry with themselves for not insisting on it. And there's an awful lot of criticism of Gorbachev and of his foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, that they didn't insist on having it set out in writing. And of course, in order to understand that, you have to go back to the events of the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Soviet Union was in deep crisis. Gorbachev was staking everything on good relations with the West. He was in a very, very weak position. And at the same time, he was very starry eyed about the West. So I think he didn't want to press for a proper treaty, which is what he absolutely should have done in that kind of situation, because he didn't want to create controversy and argument and get bogged down in a complex negotiation. And he said, well, these people are telling me this. I can trust them. They're going to be our friends. We're putting aside, communism. We're all becoming bourgeois. You notice Putin mentioned that
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
we're all bourgeois now. So why are you critical of us? So he didn't do it. And as I said, there's been much, much criticism of him in Russia. But I think people nonetheless need to take a step back and think very carefully about what they're saying about this. Because to me, this issue about the fact that this promise was not put on paper distracts from the fact that the promise was unquestionably made. It was made not just once, but repeatedly by many, many Western leaders. There's been many attempts in the West to deny this fact, but we have a massive accumulation of evidence that confirms this. And we also know that this attempt to pretend that it was something to do just with Germany itself and not with Eastern Europe, that there were actually assurances given to the Russians that flatly contradict that. So the fact is, this promise was made, and it was made repeatedly and many times, and the Russians acted on that promise. What is it exactly that Westerners are saying? That, we can make a promise, but unless it's written down in writing and written out in our blood and stamped with 150 seals or whatever that means, that promise doesn't count for anything. I mean, that is ridiculous. Again, international relations of any sort cannot be conducted in that way. This was a promise, by the way, made publicly. I should say that I can remember, I was alive then. I can remember hearing the German Foreign Minister Hans Dietrich Genscher, for example, going on television. He's used to speaking. He spoke English, very good English, and actually telling us that he'd given the Russians that specific promise. I remember it. I remember reading about it at the time. So you can't just walk away from a promise like that, such a big and important promise, because it hasn't been set out in some treaty. But it would have been better if it had been written down. And of course, as I said, many Russians are very, very critical of Gorbachev for not insisting on it.
If there's any consolation, what I can say is even it's written down, I'm not sure the West will follow it anyway. They will always find ways. I mean, they signed a three communique with China. That's basically the funding documents of China-US relations when they established a diplomatic relationship. The three communiques signed by three US presidents from both parties, they still violated that. They are doing that now. They are selling weapons to Taiwan. Record number. I mean, there are more money. They're talking about giving Taiwan more money to buy more weapons. Just as now. Okay, that's what they're doing. Even though they promised that they are going to gradually reduce all the arms sales, and at the point that they no longer need to sell any more arms. They promised that 40 years ago. It is on paper, it is signed, but they're still violating that. So I don't know whether signing it down will. I mean, it's still better to have it on paper, because then you at least have the moral high ground. You have paper to show, okay, this is. But in the end, in practical terms, I'm not even sure they will just keep
Well,
the promise. That's what I'm
well,
saying.
this is completely correct. It's also true about the Russians. The Russians agreed arms control treaties with the West, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the intermediate nuclear forces treaty, a whole string of other treaties, the Open Skies Treaty, all of those treaties. The West Americans said, doesn't suit us anymore. We can just tear them up, and they did, and walk away from them. You're absolutely correct, but bad as it was for the US to walk away from those arms control treaties, the treaties, the agreements, the communiques with China over Taiwan are even more serious, because, as you absolutely correctly say, those communiques are foundational. They're foundational. And the whole basis upon which Chinese American relations were constructed depends on the fact that the US agreed to those communiques. But you see, this is very much, again, the practice of the United States. It goes all the way back. Even in the 19th century, they were doing it. They were coming to all kinds of agreements with all the Native American tribes, all sorts of treaties. No
Yeah,
longer,
that's right.
when the treaties didn't suit them any longer, they just, forgot about the treaties. The trouble is, it's terrible to do that to Native American tribes. It's deeply dishonorable and insincere and hypocritical, but you can always overwhelm them. When you're dealing with great powers like China and Russia, it becomes an incredibly dangerous thing to do.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. I mean, you can't deal with another great power so casually, right? Today I'm agreed to this, and then tomorrow I don't agree to it. It's so casual that the way they treated this very, very serious matters. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I have to say that it's very typical of the Americans. And of course, they invariably lie about it. I mean,
Yeah.
they lie about the Minsk Agreement, another agreement. I mean, many agreements. They didn't sign the Minsk Agreement, but remember, Germany and France did, and Merkel and Hollande. So I don't know. We know the Ukrainians weren't violating the Minsk Agreement, and we're perfectly fine with them violating the Minsk Agreement. So I mean, all of these agreements, and again, I don't know. Chinese people here so well, but it's certainly in Russia. Russia is very much an honor culture, by the way. This is an aspect of Russian culture that is difficult to Westerners to understand. But Russians take agreements and promises, specifically promises, very seriously. I mean, even in the worst times in the 1990s, if you made an agreement with a Russian businessman, he might be an utterly corrupt oligarch.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he would honor that promise, because that is an obligation entered into. I suspect China is the same. People take promises given very seriously indeed, and act on them, and assume the people they're dealing with will do the same. And, you come up against a country like the United States, which doesn't take its promises seriously, which you agree something which you think you have, and it doesn't mean anything. And of course, that destroys all foundations to work forward, to do anything from that point onwards.
And that's part of the reason the relationship is so difficult, between US and China now, between US and Russia. Yeah, that's part of it. Is that whatever the promise made, and it's always like a turnaround, or maybe a different administration, then just totally off, So yeah. Well, and then the other thing is about Viktor Yanukovych. I didn't know that when he was elected, he was backed by the West. I didn't know that. And but I never thought he was that pro-Russia. I just thought he's trying to balance Russia, with the European unions, and so to get the best deal for Ukraine, which he should do. As a president of Ukraine, he should do that. But somehow, I guess the West find him too independent. So he was picked by the West and then dropped by the West. Is that
This is exactly correct. This is exactly. I mean, I was following all this situation very clearly. I mean, his opponent, the previous president of Ukraine, was a man called Viktor Yushchenko, who was indeed pro-Western and very anti-Russian. But he was such an incompetent and disastrous president that it was absolutely clear that he stood no chance, however hard you tried to rig the vote, of getting re-elected. And he got, I think, about 2% of the vote when the election came round. So basically, it came down to one of two people: Viktor Yanukovych, who was, a cynical, corrupt oligarch, somebody that the West, however, knew and they could deal with and work with, and Yulia Tymoshenko, who was his opponent, who was also a cynical, corrupt oligarch, but one who was known to get on with Putin very well. So given that choice, obviously you prefer Yanukovych. And they did. They supported Yanukovych until the moment came when they didn't, where, as you correctly said, he tried to balance relations between Russia and the West. And of course, the West wouldn't accept that. And they negotiated this agreement with him, association agreement between Ukraine and the EU. And when he realized how utterly lopsided it was and wanted to renegotiate a few parts of it, well, they basically engineered his removal.
Talking about being independent, I mean, Ukraine seems like a never independent country. It seems to me, even though it has elections, but it doesn't seem like they have.
Well, this is absolutely true. I mean, it did not gain independence in 1991. It replaced one form of subordination, the one to Moscow, with another form of subordination, the one to Washington. Except, of course, that at least, one has to say this, when it was part of the Soviet Union, it was a constituent republic. It did rather well economically. Living standards grew. All sorts of things happened. With the West, with subordination to Washington, it has led to economic collapse, mass poverty, and war.
Yeah. And then regarding this Istanbul negotiation, right? I find that Boris Johnson's reaction is interesting. Now, he wrote in a piece on the Daily Mail. I read that. Well, what I find is that he actually didn't really outright deny his role in that. Now, here's what he said. Okay, he said that he, meaning Tucker Carlson, did not challenge the ludicrous suggestion that the UK government persuaded the Ukrainians to fight on rather than surrender to Putin's tender mercies in the spring of 2022. That doesn't say to me that he's saying, I never told, Zelensky to do this or not to do this. I didn't tell them not to go through with this peace deal. He's just basically saying, okay, Tucker Carlson, you need to challenge more of what Putin is saying. Yeah. Isn't that so? That's not a direct deny.
You are completely correct. That's not a denial at all. In fact, in a kind of a way, it's almost an admission, because basically he's saying that if the Ukrainians had indeed accepted this terrible peace, it would in effect have been a kind of capitulation. So, I mean, but you're absolutely right. It is not a denial. It is typical Boris Johnson. He's very, very slippery in his language. And what this episode, however, demonstrates, and it's not just Tucker Carlson and what Putin said over that interview, but if you've been reading the American and British media, not the big newspapers, but the magazines that the foreign policy establishments of these two countries read, The Spectator in Britain, National Interest in the United States, they are clearly becoming very nervous about what happened in Istanbul in 2022. And they're trying constantly to find ways round it and to try to explain that the negotiations collapsed without the West playing any role in that. without Boris Johnson or the Americans playing any role in that. The problem they have is that there is far too much evidence from witnesses who've already come forward and spoken out. Ukrainians, Israelis, Turks, Russians, of course, all telling us the same thing, that it was in fact the West that caused the negotiations to fail. So they're becoming very, very nervous about this. They're becoming very worried that the Russians at some point are going to release a copy of that draft treaty. And they're also becoming very worried that when that happens, which will probably happen at some point when Ukraine itself collapses, the blame for that collapse, the finger of blame will be pointed at them.
Yeah. And about the Ukraine, so the Zelensky finally fired Zaluzny, right? But he replaced him with Syrskiy, right? So who is this guy, Syrskiy? I just want to learn a little more about him. I don't know much about him. So he didn't replace him with Budanov that we
No.
thought. Yeah. So
No.
what's there? What's going on?
No, I mean, the opposition to Budanov was just too strong. Apparently, that was the original plan, but the opposition was just too strong. I mean, putting in charge a man who knows nothing about how to command armies was too much, and apparently the military weren't accepting it. So by default, he picked the man who is actually Ukraine's most senior and most experienced general, who is Syrskiy. Now, the problem with Syrskiy is he's Russian. He's actually native Russian. He was born in Russia, in Vladimir. His parents are still alive. They are fervid Russian patriots and supporters of President Putin. His brother won't speak to him, and his son won't speak to him either. So, I mean, he's, and that, of course, the fact that he's Russian makes him, in many respects, unwelcome to the more nationalist-minded element within Ukraine itself. He's also entirely a product of the Soviet military system. I mean, he joined the military during the Soviet Union. There's photographs now appearing of him marching with other Soviet troops on Red Square during the November Day commemorations. He's not, by the way, a particularly well-trained officer. And I think this is true, by the way, of Zaluzny as well. I mean, both of them attended what you might call officer training school, but they never attended the higher academies, either in the Soviet Union or in the West, where general staff officers are trained. And by general consensus, he is an experienced officer and a very tough one, but not one who really understands wider battles. And his record has been one of failure. I mean, he commanded Ukrainian troops in 2014 and 2015 and was badly defeated at a place called Debaltseve. He was badly defeated last year in a battle called Bakhmut. He's been badly defeated in various places.
Yeah.
And he has a reputation for being someone who defends positions which are undefendable and for launching offensives which he insists on prosecuting, but which invariably miscarry and which result in huge losses for his men. So apparently he's deeply unpopular within the Ukrainian army.
But he probably listens to Zelensky. Probably he does what Zelensky asked him to do. Probably he's easy to be pushed around or something. Is that the reason?
He absolutely, because of course the only reason he is commanding the Ukrainian forces is because Zelensky has appointed him. He knows perfectly well, I mean, he must know at some level that most of the officers don't like him. They don't like him because he's not Ukrainian, and they don't like him because he's been unsuccessful. So that makes him heavily dependent on Zelensky. And that means that he does what Zelensky orders.
Yeah, and the picture you're talking about, there are lots of footage in China. Chinese social media is all over the place that he's marching on the Red Square. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Okay, Now, the Russian also puts Estonia Prime Minister Kalakalis on a wanted list. Now, I read the Western media saying because they destroyed the Soviet monuments. Well, the Chinese media said actually some of them actually dig out the Soviet soldiers' graves,
Yes,
something like
it's true.
that.
Yeah,
So,
it's
I
true.
mean, do you agree that Estonia would never do something like that if it's not part of NATO? They dare to do it to poke Russia, humiliate Russia this way, is because they are NATO member. Do you think that?
Absolutely, no question about this. I mean, that is exactly why they do it. They know it because they are members of NATO. They know that they have NATO to defend them. They're violating agreements, by the way, that they entered into with the Russians when they gained their independence. They were supposed to look after these graves, but of course they're not doing so. And they're being deliberately and intentionally provocative and, striking these really ugly poses because they know they have the backing and protection of the West. And it upsets and angers many, many people in Russia, just as in China. The graves
Yeah.
of soldiers who defended the motherland, both in Russia and China, are sacred.
Mhm.
And when they see the Estonians doing this kind of thing, Russians are furious about it.
I mean, I can understand. I mean, any country would be furious, right? You do
Mm.
something like that.
Mm.
But that doesn't, isn't that also telling us that NATO is simply not good for peace because this is so unnecessary? I mean, what does it do for the people in Estonia when you do something like that? You actually unnecessarily upset Russia and unnecessarily create this very tense situation with Russia, isn't it?
You are completely correct. You are entirely right. I mean, NATO is not good for peace. It is destabilizing the situation in Europe. And I get to say it, it is putting Estonia and the other Baltic states who have similar approaches and policies in what is ultimately a very dangerous position. Now, I don't think the Russians have any plan to march on the Baltic states. In fact, Putin went out of his way in his program to say that they don't have any such plans. He said, why would we want to conquer Latvia? But, of course, going forward, Russia is this colossally powerful country close to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Many people like to say that Estonia is just a drive away from St. Petersburg, a day's drive from St. Petersburg. It's true. In fact, you can also argue that it's St. Petersburg. You can drive very quickly to Estonia as well. It's a small place. You should not want to make an enemy of this enormously powerful country that's much bigger than yourself next door. And of course, you're doing that in reliance upon a guarantee of another country, which is an ocean away, a continent and an ocean away. I mean, ultimately, this encouragement of the Baltic states to behave in this fashion towards Russia, one can very easily see how at some point in the future they could find themselves deeply exposed and in a very insecure position with a very angry Russia on their doorstep and an America that has other things to worry about and isn't going to protect them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that day will come. They're going to regret
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
That is, yeah, they will. Okay, now the Ukraine war, how does it continue? Because the money, this $95 billion bill, seems it passed the Senate, but I don't think it will pass the House because Johnson, the speaker, already said he's not going to put it on the floor to vote on it. If it doesn't get voted on, it will die. Now, by the way,
Yeah.
this $94 billion, I would call it basically a criminal bill. It's a war bill because 60 billion is going to Ukraine, which is keep fighting a war that everybody knows is not winnable. And then 14.1 billion goes to Israel, which is supporting a genocide. And then the other remaining part is going to China, Taiwan, to provoke a war with China.
Yeah.
So this
You're
is a crazy bill.
You are right on every single point. Everybody talks about Ukraine and the fact that it's allocating $61 billion to continue a war in Ukraine, which is already lost. And that is outrageous. But the other two parts are worse. I mean, Israel, there's already a legal decision from the International Court of Justice that Israel is possibly perpetrating a genocide in Gaza. Israel is under orders to take certain measures to prevent that genocide. It is flouting those orders. And the United States proposes to give it $17 billion so that it can presumably continue to carry out its genocide in Gaza. And, well, we've already talked about the three communiques, which are foundational to China-US relations. The United States recognizes Taiwan as part of China. That is what the United States itself has agreed to. And yet it is arming a entity in Taiwan which it does not recognize as a government, and which is an entity which is fiercely opposed to China, to the government of China, which is ultimately, of course, the government of Taiwan, as the United States itself recognizes. This is a terrible bill. And, let's not be too kind to Speaker Johnson. He's going to stop this bill going to the House because he doesn't want funding going to Ukraine, because Donald Trump is going out and he doesn't want funding to Ukraine. And there's other Republicans who are very angry about funding to Ukraine because they can see that the war there is being lost. But no one is objecting to these other provisions.
Yes.
They're not prepared to these two worst provisions. In fact, Speaker Johnson wants to go ahead with funding to Israel and Taiwan. He wants to separate the funding for these, I won't call them countries, from the question of Ukraine. And it's quite likely at some point that he will get what he wants. So, it is a totally criminal bill.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it. Yeah, I also agree with you that they will find a way for continue the support to Israel, and the money will find its way to Taiwan. Yeah. But the 60 billion, let's say if it doesn't get through, so what happened next then? If in the end it doesn't get passed, what happens?
Well, it is the end of Ukraine. It cannot continue the war without American help. But I have to say, that would only in itself, though, bring forward an outcome which we are already seeing play out in Ukraine now. I've been following the events of today. Specifically today, and the growing sense I'm getting is that we are in the early stages in Ukraine of a Ukrainian military collapse. Now, if they get the $60 billion and the United States rushes aid in fast, perhaps they can slow that down. But they will only be able to slow it down for a couple of weeks or months at most, because Ukraine is short of so much now and disorganized to such an extent, and its economy is essentially ceased to exist, that it's just keeping a near dead patient on life support for just a short time longer.
Yeah. Okay. They prolong the unavoidable. Okay. So now talking about Gaza, right? So Israel is now bombing Rafah, right? And I do find that the pressure is mounting. Like even Joseph Borrell, I find, he said something, if you think that the death toll is not proportionate, then you shouldn't give that many weapons, meaning the US government shouldn't be continuing to give so many weapons to Israel. And then even in the US Senate, right, there are senators like Chris Van Hollen from Maryland. He has been talking about this, that this thing has to stop. He's calling for ceasefire. Australia MP, Josh Wilson, is calling for a ceasefire. And then the Dutch court said the Dutch government cannot sell F-35 parts to Israel, etc. So the pressure I do find is mounting. But John Kirby is still very defiant when he was asked about this. So there is no sign of backing down. Still, is that just like everything else? They don't have reverse gear again?
You are completely right about this. I mean, amongst all those other people who are criticizing this operation in Rafah, I mean, even Annalena Baerbock has now
Mm.
come out and has criticized it. And I mean, she has been, fervently supportive of Israel until this point, as she is fervently supportive of every bad cause. But even she has come to understand that Rafah is just too far. And of course, we also have the ticking clock, which is now the deadline that the ICJ imposed is, I think, about 10 days away. And there are now hints and reports and rumors that if this deadline is not met, there will be a meeting of the General Assembly and there might be pressure on the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to issue indictments. So all kinds of things are coming together now. But you're absolutely right. The United States itself is showing no sign of wavering in its support for Israel. And it is absolutely what you said. There is no reverse gear. For the administration to change course is too complicated, it would seem, electorally. And I think it is also very, very strongly opposed by many people within the US government, including the president himself, who remains fervidly, even fanatically, supportive of Israel. So they're just going to continue doing what they are doing, even as the situation gets worse and worse for them. And I mentioned earlier in our program the fact that I had a discussion yesterday with Ambassador Chas Freeman. Now, the reason he's ambassador is because he was ambassador to Saudi Arabia,
Mhm.
and he knows the Saudis. And the Saudi Arabian government, which has now, of course, joined the BRICS, apparently that is now confirmed, they issued a statement a couple of days ago hypercritical of the United States and, by the way, of John Kirby personally. So you see that even a country like Saudi Arabia, long-standing ally of the United States in the region, is saying enough. And yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of the doubts that are accumulating in Europe now, despite the collapse of support around the world for Israel and for the US policy, in spite of the growing doubts in the United States, it's full steam ahead. We go on in this direction. We continue with this war. It's like, that ship, the Titanic, which went towards the iceberg. The captain sees the iceberg and he says, let's continue full steam ahead. We'll somehow be able to smash through.
Yeah, how long they can keep on doing this? I mean, at some point the tide will turn against
Yeah,
it. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
it will coming. I mean, okay. Now, related to that, I find this because I want to ask you something about the Ireland, right? So the new, they call it the first minister. Is that the same as prime minister?
Yes. Yes.
Michelle O'Neill. Okay,
Yes.
she is from the Sinn Fein, right? That's
Yes.
her party is.
Yes.
And then at the same time, that I find interesting. And then also at the same time, the Sinn Féin's I think President Mary Lou McDonald, she openly said that Ireland should expel Israel ambassador. She
Yes.
actually said that. So
Yes.
what is your view of Michelle O'Neill and the Sinn Féin is now in charge of Ireland?
Right. Well, Sinn Fein, for most of its history, has been the party um, that has represented the Irish independence movement against Britain. It was formed way back in 1916. It means ourselves alone, by the way. It fought the British. It led the Revolutionary War, the Independence War against the British, which the Irish people fought from 1916 to 1922. Um, it, it, it then split in disastrously in 1922 because the terms of the independence treaty were unsatisfactory because the north of Ireland was Britain continued to retain control of it. It then eventually went underground. It then resumes revolutionary activities. It conducted a very, very fierce armed struggle in Northern Ireland against the British from from the late 1960s until the 1990s. Uh, and then it re-emerged and it became, a political party. And many people say about Sinn Fein, and I have been to Ireland. I mean, I know people from Sinn Fein, I should say. I've met people who were members of the Irish Republican Army, the um, military wing of of Sinn Fein, who fought the British in the 70s and 80s. I've met many very, very senior people within that organisation. Anyway, the general feeling is that since it became part of the political landscape, the conventional political landscape, Sinn Fein has lost its radical revolutionary edge. It's become much more assimilated into the political system. It used to be a very radical socialist party. That has basically all been dropped. It's no longer pursuing Irish unification to the extent that it did, and it's even considering Ireland eventually joining NATO, which it used to strongly oppose. But it still retains some elements of its past. And the Irish independence movement, which was represented by Sinn Fein, identified very strongly with the Palestinians
Mm-hmm.
because they felt that the struggle the Palestinians were fighting was very similar to the struggle that they themselves were fighting against the British. And there's always been, therefore, a very, very strong sympathy in it within Sinn Fein, and by the way, amongst Irish people generally, for the Palestinian struggle. And that is where this is coming from. Now, whether it will happen is another matter. As I said, Sinn Fein still talks in this way, but whether it's prepared to go all the way and, as a major political force within Ireland, push for Ireland to break relations with Israel and recognize a Palestinian state is another matter. I doubt it, actually.
Yeah, yeah, I doubt it too. I think all these people, I don't know, once they're in power, they seems always trying to still get
Mm,
into the whatever the main
yeah.
controller, the European Union narratives, they seems always go along with that.
Yes. I mean, if you want a much more authentic, if you wanted an example, a political leader in Ireland who speaks authentically and sincerely in the way that Sinn Fein used to do, and who was, I believe, once a member of Sinn Fein, then Claire Daly,
Yeah.
who is an MP in the European Parliament, and whom I've also, by the way, met.
Hmm.
She's much more outspoken than Sinn Fein ever is nowadays.
Yeah, she's much more authentic. Yes, I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah. Now, one more thing is that George Galloway is now running for something MP, I believe, in
Yeah.
Rockdale. Rockdale. What is that about? It's only for a short period of time, right? Why is he doing it? So,
Well, it is only a short period of time, but of course, it will get him back into big league British politics. He'll become again a member of the British Parliament. If
uh-huh.
he's elected MP for Rochdale in this by-election, there is a chance that he will be re-elected again
Oh,
in
okay.
the general election that is coming. And of course, if he does get into the British Parliament, and we mentioned Claire Daly, and the fact that she's an anti-war, anti-imperialist MP in the European Parliament, well, Britain will finally have a similarly outspoken and brave and authentic anti-war and anti-imperialist MP in the British Parliament. And it's strange because up to this point, all the way that things have worked out seem to favour him. The Labour candidate imploded. He was the one I mentioned who made a comment which got him cancelled. The Green Party candidate has run into similar problems, and he's essentially cancelled as well. There is another ex-Labour MP who's trying to stand and trying to win back Rochdale. He is a disgraced figure who's been convicted of child offence things. So I can't imagine that in this very conservative constituency with a very large Muslim electorate, he has any prospect of winning. And Conservatives do not win in Rochdale. So by a process of elimination, it looks likely that Galloway will be elected. And Galloway, I should make this clear. I slightly know him. We've met several times. I've appeared on his programs. We don't know each other socially, but we have met, we have spoken, we've had discussions. We know each other. We address each other with first name terms. We're not, I want to stress, we're not friends. We're not enemies, but we're not friends. But Galloway, if he is elected as an MP, in my experience, people like him. He is a good MP. He looks after the people he's supposed, who vote for him. He takes up their cases. He shows an interest. He does the MP's work in a serious way, and as a result, he tends to get re-elected.
Okay, yeah. And when does that happen? Do you know?
Oh, it's just a short time now. I mean, I think it's about a week or 2 weeks away. We will know one way or the other.
Yeah, it would be interesting to have if he's back in the political scene, right? In Britain, and he will be a powerful voice. Yeah,
he will be a powerful voice if he's elected to the parliament and then is re-elected again in the general election. Then he will be an even more powerful voice in the next parliament. Though I will say this: come the general election, they will pull out every trick to stop him getting re-elected.
Yeah, we'll see. Now, I want to end our conversation in a happy, relatively happy news, is that it seems like the European farmers are, their protesting is going their way now, that the politicians are backing down. Is that what is going on?
I think that's right. And it does show the protest can make a difference, despite all the obstacles and all of the problems. Of course, the difficulty is the governments might back down, wait a little, and then come back and do the same thing all over again, which, by the way, is very common in the West. But even if they do back down, it will be an important victory nonetheless.
Yeah. So, I hope I can never understand how can they mistreat farmers like this, because farmers are producing food for us, right? So it's just so strange to me that this whole thing that what are they doing? I guess ultimately is they lost connections. They don't have a deep feeling or understanding of the society outside their bubble. I guess that's ultimately the problem.
No, they don't. They don't. And the reason they are backing down is not because they're coming round to agreeing with the farmers. It's not because they think that the farmers were in the right. If they're back down, they're going to be furious about the fact that they back down. They're going to back down because the weight of public opinion in Europe is overwhelmingly supporting the farmers, and that isn't something that they can deal with very easily, and that could actually lead to more things, because of course if the farmers win, then others might say, if the farmers can do this, so can we. So metal workers in Germany, for example, who've been historically a strong union, they might come out and might start protesting. Students who are under immense pressure right across the European Union. I mean, we haven't talked about the crisis in higher education in Britain and in Europe, but I mean, it is real and profound and getting worse. They may protest. All sorts of other people might protest. And in fact, we could see a wave of protests. But anyway, we'll see. But the fact that the farmers are winning, you're quite right. It is good news.
Yeah, at least they have to do something. Okay, they
Yeah.
have to.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's make me like slightly hopeful that it's still working, right? The
Yeah.
protest seems still. Yeah. Okay. All right. Again, thank you so much. It's always very enjoyable talking to you. So thank
It,
you.
it is hugely enjoyable talking to you, Sophia, and I look forward to our next program next week.
Yes. And it's so interesting that it's always so much to cover, isn't it?
The world, we're living at a very, very important point in history. I mean, it was Lenin who said that sometimes the events of 10 years happen in a week.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
then
Yeah. Yes.
sometimes 10 years events which you might have expected to happen in a single week,
Yeah.
they take 10 years to happen. But we're in the first case of that. I mean, history is moving very rapidly at this moment, and we come back to the reason that there is one overwhelming reason for this. The United States and the Western powers, they are
Hmm.
in crisis. They
Hmm.
sense that they're losing control. They sense that the other powers are rising, and this creates enormous tensions.
Hmm. Yeah, next time let's talk more about China because this time because Tucker Carlson's interview, right? So, but unless
Yeah,
something else happens, a week it could
yeah,
be a long time. Nothing can
yes.
happen in a week.
Well,
So
indeed,
we,
absolutely. Well, indeed,
yeah.
absolutely. You're completely right. I mean, again, I don't want to dwell on this, but again, the British media are again full of the Chinese economic crisis, as they call it. And then you go and read the articles, and you find that when you actually look at the evidence that they're putting
Mhm.
together, it is not a crisis, and I mean nothing like a crisis. But anyway, I mean a lot of misrepresentation about what is going on in China at the
Yeah.
present time.
Yeah. Let's talk about that next Wednesday. Okay.